Amelia stared at the television, the wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. The man being lauded as the visionary architect Aurelius, the genius behind the new city skyline, was David. Her David. The man she had thrown out onto the street 2 years ago, calling him nothing. The world was celebrating him as a once-in-a-generation talent, the reclusive mastermind who had reshaped modern design. And she had traded him for an empty penthouse and the brittle approval of her father. The nameplate on the screen read, David Vance, Principal Architect, Keystone Designs. The face was the same, the quiet eyes that always seemed to be observing, analyzing, the calm, almost serene set of his jaw. But the context was shatteringly different. He wasn't standing in their cramped apartment, apologetically explaining a delayed payment from a small-time client. He was standing on a stage, accepting the Pritzker Prize, the highest honor in his field, while titans of industry and culture gave him a standing ovation. The life she had discarded, the man she had deemed a failure, had become the very definition of the success she so desperately craved. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? It's a universal feeling, that sting of being judged on the surface while your true worth remains unseen. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories about the underdog getting their due, about patience and integrity winning out in the end, make sure to like and subscribe because you won't want to miss how this story of pride, blindness, and ultimate vindication unfolds. 2 years earlier, the air in her father's dining room was as thick and heavy as the damask curtains that blocked out the city lights. It was Richard Sterling's kingdom, and everyone at the long, polished mahogany table was a subject. Richard, a real estate developer whose success was built on a foundation of aggressive deals and an unshakable belief in his own superiority, sat at the head of the table. His wife, Eleanor, sat to his right, a portrait of passive elegance, her silence a finely tuned instrument of agreement. And across from David sat Amelia, his wife, her posture rigid, her smile a fragile, painted-on thing. David had always felt like a foreign object in this room, a piece of simple, unvarnished pine in a gallery of gilded frames. He was an architect, but not the kind Richard respected. David designed community centers, affordable housing units, and small, thoughtful homes that integrated with their natural surroundings. His work was quiet, principled, and, in Richard's eyes, utterly insignificant. "So, David," Richard began, his voice dripping with condescension as he swirled the deep red liquid in his glass. "Still designing those, what do you call them? Little garden sheds for the common folk." The other guests, a collection of Richard's business associates and their equally status-conscious spouses, offered a few polite, cruel chuckles. David felt Amelia flinch beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on his plate, focusing on the intricate pattern of the china. He had learned early on that engaging with Richard was like wrestling with a pig in mud. You both got dirty, but the pig enjoyed it. "I finished the designs for the Northwood Library extension this week," David answered, his voice even and calm. "It's a project meant to provide more resources for the local community, especially for children." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Libraries? How quaint. While you're building bookshelves, I'm building empires." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. "Speaking of which, I have an announcement." He paused for dramatic effect, ensuring he had the full attention of his audience. "Sterling Properties has secured the initial agreement to build the Phoenix Tower." A murmur of impressed whispers went around the table. The Phoenix Tower was the most ambitious construction project the city had seen in a decade, a soaring, crystalline skyscraper that promised to redefine the skyline. "It's going to be my legacy," Richard declared. "And for a legacy project, you need a legacy architect. Not some local draftsman, but a true visionary. That's why we're in final negotiations with Aurelius." The name landed with the weight of legend. Aurelius was an enigma, a world-renowned architect who had never shown his face, never given an interview. His firm, Keystone Designs, was famously selective, and his work was revolutionary. He was a ghost, a brand, a name synonymous with genius. "Aurelius," one of the guests breathed. "Richard, how did you manage that?" "Power recognizes power," Richard said with a smug grin. He understands vision. He understands what it takes to make a mark on the world, not just a scratch in the dirt. His eyes flickered to David, a silent, brutal comparison. David felt the familiar, not tighten, in his stomach. He reached into the inner pocket of his simple wool blazer, and his fingers brushed against the worn leather of his journal. It was a simple, unadorned book, but contained his entire world: sketches, equations, ideas. It was a physical manifestation of his soul, and it was the only thing that kept him anchored in moments like these. He didn't need to build empires. He needed to build things that mattered. But as he glanced at his wife, he saw the look in her eyes, a mixture of shame, disappointment, and a desperate, yearning admiration for her father's world. He knew this evening was far from over. The foundation of his marriage was trembling, and he feared it was about to collapse entirely under the weight of her father's suffocating ambition. The dinner conversation moved on, but the shadow of Richard's announcement lingered over David. Every mention of the Phoenix Tower, every sycophantic compliment directed at his father-in-law, felt like a stone being placed on his chest. Amelia grew quieter, more distant. She refused to meet his eye, instead focusing on her wine glass as if it held the answers to a question she was afraid to ask. Later, as dessert was served, a ridiculously complex tiramisu that looked more like a sculpture than food, Richard turned his attention back to David, like a predator toying with its cornered prey. "You know, David, Amelia tells me you've been working on the same project for 6 months." 6 months. Aurelius designs a new national museum in half that time. What's the holdup? Can't decide on the right shade of beige for the walls. The laughter this time was louder, less restrained. David felt his jaw tighten, but his voice remained steady. Good design takes time, Richard. It's about understanding the space, the people who will use it, and the impact it will have. It's not a race. Oh, but it is a race. Richard boomed, slapping his hand on the table, making the fine silverware jump. It's always a race. A race for capital, for prestige, for legacy. The world doesn't wait for artists to have a feeling. It responds to men who build, who act, who conquer. You wouldn't understand. This was the final, devastating blow for Amelia. Her father had just articulated the philosophy she had been raised on, the creed she had tried to unlearn when she fell in love with David's quiet passion, but which now came rushing back with the force of indoctrination. She looked at David, and for the first time, she didn't see the kind, thoughtful man she had married. She saw a failure, a man content to build with pebbles while her father moved mountains. "Why can't you be more like him, David?" she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for him. "Just once. Why can't you have that kind of ambition? Don't you want more for us?" "More what, Amelia?" David asked, his own voice low, laced with a pain she either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "More money? A bigger house? More nights like this, where father measures my worth by the height of my buildings." "Yes," she shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Yes, all of it. I'm tired of defending you. I'm tired of the polite smiles and the pitying looks when I tell people my husband is a local architect. I want a partner, not a project I have to apologize for." The silence that fell between them was more profound than the noise of the party around them. Eleanor, her mother, glanced over, her expression a placid mask of non-involvement. She saw her daughter's distress, saw the deep hurt in David's eyes, and she looked away, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. Her loyalty was to the victor, and in her world, her husband always won. The drive home was a cold war fought in a small, enclosed space. Amelia stared out her window, the city lights blurring into streaks of condemnation. David drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, the knuckles white. The quiet between them was filled with unspoken accusations. When they arrived at their modest apartment, the one David's careful work had paid for, the one Amelia now saw as a symbol of their mediocrity, the dam broke. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat and final as she stood in the middle of the living room. "Do what, Amelia? Live a life that isn't curated by your father?" David asked, exhaustion finally fraying the edges of his calm. "No, live a life with no future," she retorted. "You have no drive, no vision. You're content in your little world, and you're dragging me down with you. My father is building a legacy. What are you building, David? A collection of participation trophies. He didn't have an answer for her, not one she would understand. He couldn't explain that his legacy wasn't meant to be written in steel and glass, but in the lives of the people who used his spaces. He couldn't articulate the quiet satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful without needing the world's applause. To her, in that moment, it would have sounded like just another excuse for his perceived failure. She walked to the closet, pulled out his duffel bag, and began to shove his clothes into it with angry, jerky movements. "I want you to leave," she said, not looking at him. "Amelia, don't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking for the first time. "We can talk about this. This is your father talking, not you." She zipped the bag and threw it on the floor between them. "No, David. This is me, finally seeing clearly. I need more. I deserve more." She walked to the front door and opened it, a gesture of final, brutal dismissal. "I can't be married to nothing. Please, just go." He stood there for a long moment, the man who built things, watching his own life be dismantled. He looked at the woman he loved, her face a mask of cold resolve, and saw a stranger. He picked up his bag. As he walked past her, he paused. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Amelia," he said softly. He walked out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him with an air of absolute finality. He was alone, with a bag of clothes and a leather-bound journal filled with secrets, cast out from a life he thought was his own. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, but beneath it, a tiny, hard ember of resolve began to glow. He had been quiet. He had been patient. He had been underestimated. That was about to change. The city at night was a lonely place when you had nowhere to go. David walked for hours, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, growing heavier with each step. The gleaming skyscrapers, including the plot of land where the Phoenix Tower would one day stand, seemed to mock him, symbols of a world he had just been violently ejected from. He didn't feel anger, not yet. The primary emotion was a profound, hollow ache, the pain of being utterly misunderstood by the one person he thought truly saw him. Amelia hadn't just left him. She had erased him, reducing years of shared life and quiet partnership to a single, damning word: nothing. Finally, just before dawn, he found himself outside a minimalist, modern building in a renovated industrial district. The sign by the door was discreet, almost invisible, a simple K, intertwined with a stylized keystone. This was the public office of Keystone Designs. He used his key and let himself in. The space was dark and quiet, smelling of coffee and drafting paper. It was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where he wasn't David Vance, the disappointing son-in-law, but simply a creator. He switched on a single desk lamp, illuminating a large drafting table covered in blueprints. He dropped his bag, pulled out the worn leather journal, and sat down. For a moment, he just sat in the silence, letting the shock and grief wash over him. Then he opened the journal. Its pages were filled with his elegant, precise handwriting and intricate sketches, designs for buildings that had won anonymous awards, concepts for urban parks, and, on the last few pages, the initial breathtakingly ambitious drawings for the Phoenix Tower. A soft footstep broke the silence. "I had a feeling I might find you here." Sarah stood in the doorway of her office, a mug of tea in her hands. She was his partner, his oldest friend, and one of only two people in the world who knew the truth. She had a sharp, intelligent face and an air of no-nonsense competence that had been instrumental in building their firm. "She kicked me out," David said, his voice rough. Sarah didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply nodded, pulled up a stool, and sat beside him. "Richard's dinner party." He announced he was in final negotiations with Aurelius for the Phoenix Tower, David said, a bitter, ironic smile touching his lips. "He spent the entire night telling me what a real architect does." Sarah shook her head, a flash of anger in her eyes. "That man wouldn't know real architecture if it fell on him. He thinks it's about ego. You think it's about service. He's a monument builder. You're a world builder." She gestured around the studio. This place, this work, everything we've built, that's not nothing, David. The secret of Aurelius had started as a necessity. In an industry dominated by celebrity architects and flashy presentations, David wanted his work to be judged on its own merits. He created the pseudonym, and Sarah, with her business acumen, built the corporate shield of Keystone designs around it. The strategy had worked better than they could have imagined. Free from the cult of personality, Aurelius became a legend, a name associated with pure, unadulterated design genius. And David, the man behind the curtain, was free to focus on the work itself. But the shield that protected his professional life had left his personal life vulnerable. The irony is, David continued, tracing the lines of the tower on a sketch pad. I was going to tell her everything tonight. I thought if she understood, if she saw what I was really building, she would have seen the money and the fame, not the work, Sarah said gently but firmly. David, you married her hoping she loved the man, but she was always in love with her father's idea of a man. Meanwhile, across the city, Amelia and her family were raising glasses of champagne. The mood was celebratory, a collective sigh of relief. To new beginnings, Richard toasted, beaming at his daughter. You did the right thing, sweetheart. You cut out the dead weight. A woman of your caliber needs a man of substance. Amelia forced a smile, the champagne bubbles tasting like ash in her mouth. She felt a strange, disorienting mix of relief and guilt. She had freed herself from the constant, low-grade embarrassment of David's career. She had realigned herself with her family's values, with the world of power and influence she had been raised to covet. So why did it feel so hollow? Now, Richard continued, his energy boundless. We can focus on what's important. Finalizing the contract with Aurelius. Once his name is attached to the Phoenix Tower, our financing is secured, and Marcus Thorne will be eating our dust. Marcus Thorne was Richard's chief rival, a savvier, more modern developer who had been steadily chipping away at Sterling Properties' market share. Are you sure you can land him, Dad? Amelia asked, a sliver of anxiety cutting through her manufactured confidence. Richard laughed, a big, booming sound that filled the penthouse. Of course. I sent his firm the most generous preliminary offer they've ever seen. They're drawing up the final contracts now. Geniuses like that are drawn to visionaries like me. It's a natural law. Eleanor patted her daughter's hand. Your father always gets what he wants, dear, she said, her voice soft and certain. You made the right choice. You'll see. Amelia nodded, wanting to believe it, needing to believe it. She had made her bet. She had wagered her marriage on the belief that David was a nobody and her father was an invincible king. It was a bet she was supremely confident she would win. She had no way of knowing that the quiet, unassuming man she had just exiled held the deed to the entire kingdom. In the weeks that followed, David threw himself into his work with a monk-like devotion. The pain of his separation was a constant, low hum beneath the surface, but he channeled it into fuel. He and Sarah worked relentlessly, not just on their existing projects, but on a new, private one. While Richard Sterling was busy preparing press releases and bragging to investors about his impending partnership with the great Aurelius, David was quietly executing a series of strategic financial maneuvers. He had always been as much a strategist as he was an artist. He understood that the foundation of a building wasn't just concrete, but capital, debt, and market forces. He had watched Richard operate for years, noting his over-leveraged positions, his reliance on a single, massive project to secure his future, and his arrogant dismissal of smaller, more stable assets. Using the immense, unleveraged capital generated by Keystone Designs, David began to buy up the debt on several of Richard's secondary properties through a series of anonymous holding companies. He wasn't planning a hostile takeover. It was a defensive measure. He knew Richard's business practices were often unethical, and he wanted to ensure that if he did sign on to the Phoenix Tower project, he would have the leverage to ensure it was built his way, with respect for the workers, the community, and the environment. It was a chess move in a game Richard didn't even know he was playing. Amelia, for her part, tried to embrace her new life. She went to society galas on her father's arm, bought expensive clothes, and lunched with friends who talked of little but their husbands' bonuses and their latest vacations. She was living the life she claimed she wanted, surrounded by the very status symbols she had accused David of denying her. Yet, a persistent sense of unreality plagued her. The laughter felt forced, the conversations brittle and meaningless. In quiet moments, her mind would drift back to David, to the easy comfort of their evenings, the way he would explain the beauty of a perfectly designed joint, his quiet passion that she had mistaken for a lack of ambition. She would squash these thoughts immediately, reminding herself of his failure, of her father's success. She was a Sterling. Sterlings did not look back. Her father's confidence, however, was beginning to show cracks. The final contract from Aurelius was delayed. Keystone Designs sent polite but firm emails requesting more detailed financial disclosures, more stringent environmental impact studies, more robust guarantees for worker safety. Each request was a small, frustrating delay for Richard, who was used to bulldozing his way through negotiations. Bureaucrats, he would rage after a phone call with Keystone's legal team. These pencil pushers are getting in the way of the artist. I need to speak with Aurelius directly. But a direct meeting was impossible. Aurelius, his lawyers explained, communicated only through his work and his designated representatives. This elusiveness only enhanced his mystique and, for Richard, his desirability. He became obsessed, seeing the partnership not just as a business deal, but as the ultimate validation of his own genius. The pressure mounted as his rival, Marcus Thorne, announced a major, successful development on the other side of town, drawing investors and positive press. Richard's lenders were getting nervous. The Phoenix Tower, his great hope, was still just a hole in the ground and a set of preliminary drawings. He needed Aurelius. His entire empire now depended on the signature of a man he had never met. The quiet before the storm arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. Richard, after weeks of frantic back and forth, finally received an email from Keystone Designs. They had agreed to a final meeting to sign the partnership agreement. His relief was tidal. He called an emergency board meeting, not just for the board members, but for his family. He wanted them to be there, to witness his ultimate triumph, the moment that would silence all his critics and secure the Sterling legacy forever. He's coming around, Richard announced to Amelia and Eleanor over dinner that night, his face flushed with victory. The meeting is set for tomorrow morning. We're going to sign the papers, and the world will see what a real visionary can do. He looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with a rare paternal pride. I'm so glad you're not tied to that little man anymore, sweetheart. Tomorrow, you'll see what a real empire looks like. Amelia felt a surge of validation. This was it, the proof that she had been right all along. The hollow feeling in her chest was replaced by a giddy anticipation. Tomorrow, all her doubts would be vanquished. Tomorrow, her father would be crowned king, and she would be the princess at his side. The next morning, David stood before the mirror in his minimalist apartment, adjusting the knot of his simple, dark tie. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, just the same kind of well-made, understated clothing he had always worn. But something about him had shifted. The quiet humility was still there, but it was now underpinned by an unshakable core of authority. He picked up his leather journal from the nightstand. It felt solid, heavy in his hand. "Ready?" Sarah asked from the doorway. She was dressed in a sharp, professional suit, her expression calm and focused. David nodded. It's time they saw the full design. The Sterling Properties boardroom was on the top floor of their current flagship building, a monument to corporate excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city David was about to reshape. Richard Sterling stood at the head of a massive granite conference table, beaming, a king surveying his domain. Eleanor and Amelia were seated to his right, their expressions a mixture of pride and anticipation. The board members, a collection of aging, complacent men in expensive suits, murmured expectantly. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Richard began, his voice resonating with theatrical importance. "Today marks a historic moment for this company, for this city. Today, We formally partner with the greatest architectural mind of our generation, Aurelius. He let the name hang in the air. For months, he continued, pacing slowly, we have been in negotiations. And while some lesser minds, he gave a slight, dismissive shrug, might have been deterred by his rigorous standards, I knew that true visionaries speak the same language. The language of legacy, the language of power. Amelia felt a swell of pride for her father. He was magnificent, a titan. Everything David wasn't. She smoothed the fabric of her designer dress, feeling utterly secure in her place in the world. The representatives from Keystone Designs are on their way up now to finalize the agreement, Richard announced. And with that signature, the Phoenix Tower will rise, and the future of Sterling Properties will be assured. Right on cue, the boardroom doors opened. Richard turned, a welcoming, magnanimous smile fixed on his face, ready to greet the legal team of the great Aurelius. But it wasn't a team of lawyers who walked in. It was a single woman, Sarah. Richard's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He didn't recognize her. Can I help you? This is a private meeting. I'm here for the meeting, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. She walked forward with an unhurried confidence that seemed to disconcert him. You're from Keystone Designs? Richard asked, his tone skeptical. We were expecting Mr. Aurelius's senior legal counsel. I'm the chief operating officer of Keystone, Sarah replied, enjoying the flicker of surprise on his face. But you're right, this is a significant moment. And for a signing of this magnitude, the principal architect insisted on attending personally. She stepped to the side, holding the door open. And then David walked in. He was holding the same worn, leather-bound journal he'd had at the dinner party 2 years ago. He moved with a quiet purpose, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, every shocked face. He looked at the board members, at Eleanor's placid confusion, at Richard's sputtering disbelief, and finally, his gaze settled on Amelia. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Amelia's mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a phantom, a cruel joke. David, here, in this room, the epicenter of the power and success she had abandoned him for. The blood drained from her face, and the triumphant feeling of a moment ago curdled into a cold, terrifying dread. The carefully constructed reality she had built for herself over the past 2 years began to fracture, hairline cracks spreading through its flawless facade. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, a vacuum where sound and sense had ceased to exist. Richard Sterling's face, moments before flushed with triumph, had turned a pasty, mottled gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked from David to Sarah and back again, his brain struggling to reconcile the image of his failed, insignificant son-in-law with the context of this career-defining meeting. What is the meaning of this? He finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse whisper. He turned to one of his assistants. Security. Get him out of here. Now. David didn't flinch. He walked calmly to the head of the table, opposite Richard, and placed his leather journal on the polished granite surface. The sound was a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the cavernous silence. There's no need for that, Richard, David said. His voice was not loud, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. It was the same quiet voice, but now it was imbued with an authority no one there had ever heard from him before. You invited me. You wanted to meet Aurelius. He paused, letting the implication settle. You have. A collective gasp went through the room. The board members stared, their expressions shifting from confusion to stunned comprehension. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. But all of that was just background noise to the singular, deafening roar in Amelia's ears. Aurelius, the ghost, the genius, the legend her father had idolized, the man whose success was supposed to be the final justification for her cruelty to David, was David himself. The two images, the two identities collided in her mind with the force of a physical impact. The quiet man sketching in his notebook, the global icon reshaping skylines. They were one and the same. and she had called him nothing. That's impossible, Richard sputtered, a desperate, pathetic denial. This is a trick, a pathetic prank. Is it? Sarah interjected, her tone cool and businesslike. She produced a tablet from her briefcase and projected an image onto the large screen at the end of the room. It was the official incorporation document for Keystone Designs. The name listed as sole founder and principal shareholder was David Vance. She swiped, and articles from prestigious architectural journals appeared, praising Aurelius's work. She swiped again, and there were photos of David, previously unseen by the public, accepting awards at private industry events under his real name. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out with clinical precision. David opened his journal. He turned it so Richard could see the pages, filled with the original, hand-drawn conceptual sketches for the Phoenix Tower. Sketches that were more detailed and brilliant than anything Richard's own team had produced. I started Keystone under a pseudonym for a simple reason, David explained, his voice even, betraying no hint of the emotional storm beneath. I wanted the work to speak for itself. I wanted to build things of substance, free from the ego and the noise that so often corrupts our industry. I wanted to prove that a building's worth isn't in the name attached to it, but in the purpose it serves. His eyes briefly met Amelia's. It's a philosophy I've always believed in. Richard sank into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding of the scale of his misjudgment. He had not just insulted his son-in-law. He had mocked the very man he was desperately counting on to save him. Then David delivered the final, devastating blow. The quiet bomb. Over the past few months, while we've been discussing the terms of our partnership, I've been diversifying my portfolio, David said, his tone shifting from explanatory to something harder, sharper. I've been concerned about the financial stability of Sterling Properties. Your debt-to-asset ratio is precarious. Sarah swiped again on her tablet. A complex financial chart filled the screen, showing a web of loans and liabilities. You see, Richard, David continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational level. While you were focused on landing the big, flashy name, you took your eye off the fundamentals. You over-leveraged to fund this project, using your other properties as collateral. Properties whose debt, through a series of holding companies, I have spent the last 6 months acquiring. He paused, looking directly at Richard, whose face was now a mask of pure terror. As of 9 a.m. this morning, my acquisition of a controlling interest in your company's debt was finalized. So you see, Richard, we're not here to discuss a partnership. I'm not your potential architect. I am your principal creditor. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even further, a quiet statement of absolute power. The survival of your company, your legacy, everything you've built is now entirely and solely in my hands. The boardroom, which had been silent before, was now utterly still, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The reversal was so total, so absolute, that it defied comprehension. The man they had dismissed as a gnat had revealed himself to be the eagle circling overhead, and they had never even seen his shadow. Richard Sterling, the Titan, the empire builder, was broken. He stared at David, his face slack with shock. The arrogance that had been his defining characteristic was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified, desperate man beneath. He opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was thin, pleading. David, son, we can work this out. There must be some misunderstanding. The word son hung in the air, a pathetic, transparent appeal to a relationship he himself had systematically destroyed. David's expression remained impassive, but his eyes were like chips of ice. There is no misunderstanding, Richard. There is only clarity. The kind of clarity you get when you're finally forced to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he began his list of grievances, delivered not with anger, but with the dispassionate precision of an auditor reviewing a failed company's books. 2 years ago, in your home, you called my work garden sheds for the common folk. You said I was making a scratch in the dirt while you were building empires. He gestured to the window, towards the empty plot of land where the Phoenix Tower was supposed to stand. Well, this garden shed architect just bought your empire, or at least the debt that holds it up. He turned his gaze to the other board members, who were now avoiding his eyes, studying the granite table as if it held the secrets of the universe. You all sat there. You laughed. You nodded along. You enabled his contempt because it was easier than questioning the man who signed your checks. Then, his eyes fell on Amelia. She was pale, trembling, her hands clenched in her lap. The designer dress that had felt like armor now felt like a costume for a part she no longer knew how to play. She looked at David, this man she thought she knew, and saw a stranger, a man of immense power and control, a man she had thrown away like trash. David, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. His response was the coldest thing she had ever heard, not because it was loud or angry, but because it was simple, devastating truth. That is the entire point, Amelia. You didn't know, because you never looked. You never asked. You saw what your father wanted you to see. A failure. A disappointment. You were so blinded by the reflection of his ambition that you couldn't see the person standing right in front of you. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just talking about his secret career. He was talking about everything. About his love, his support, his quiet strength. All the things she had taken for granted and then discarded. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears finally starting to stream down her face. David, I am so sorry. Apologies are for mistakes, David said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, which somehow made it even more cutting. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice. You chose status over substance. You chose wealth over worth. You made your bet. He let that hang in the air for a moment. And you lost. Richard, seeing his daughter's tears, seemed to find a last flicker of his old bluster. He stood up, his posture shaky. What do you want, David? Money? Is that it? Name your price. Just don't do this. David almost smiled. It was a sad, tired expression. You still don't get it, do you, Richard? After all this, you still think everything has a price tag. You think you can buy your way out of consequences. He straightened up, his tone becoming formal, addressing the entire room. Here is what is going to happen. Keystone Designs will not be calling in the debt. We will not be bankrupting Sterling Properties. A wave of palpable relief washed over the board members. Instead, David continued, his voice hardening again, we will be initiating a complete corporate restructuring. I am exercising my rights as principal creditor to protect my investment. He laid out his terms with brutal efficiency. Richard would be stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. The entire board would be dissolved and a new one appointed by Keystone. The Phoenix Tower project would go forward, but under a new name and a new charter, one that prioritized sustainable materials, community benefit, and union labor, all the things Richard had dismissed as costly nonsense. You're taking my company, Richard whispered, finally understanding. No, David corrected him. I'm saving it. From you. Then, he turned his attention to Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout, a pale statue of a woman. And you, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of judgment. You stood by. At every dinner, every holiday, you watch him belittle me. You watched your daughter absorb his poison. You never said a word. You chose comfortable silence over basic human decency. I hope it was worth it. Eleanor flinched as if struck, her placid mask finally crumbling to reveal the hollow space behind it. Finally, David looked at Amelia one last time. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound sense of finality, of a chapter closed forever. You told me you wanted a partner, not a project. You wanted a man of power and ambition. You have one standing before you. But you threw away the man who loved you, not for what you could provide him or how you looked on his arm, but for who you were. He took a deep breath. Our lawyers will be in touch. The divorce papers should be ready by the end of the week. With that, he picked up his journal, gave a slight nod to Sarah, and turned and walked out of the boardroom. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had already built a new world for himself, one founded on integrity and truth. The old one with its gilded lies and crumbling foundations, was now just a ruin in his rearview mirror. The empire had fallen, not to a rival king, but to the quiet architect who had simply shown everyone the flawed design. The aftermath was not loud and explosive, but a slow, quiet collapse. The news of the restructuring at Sterling Properties hit the financial papers, but it was spun as a strategic partnership. The press release, drafted by Sarah's expert team, spoke of a new vision and synergy, praising Richard Sterling for his foresight in bringing in keystone designs to guide the company into the future. It was a masterclass in corporate communication, a way to save the company without airing the humiliating personal drama that underpinned it. Richard was given a generous severance and the title of Consultant Emeritus, a meaningless honorific that allowed him to save a sliver of face while being stripped of all power. He was effectively exiled, forced into a quiet, impotent retirement. For Richard, the loss of his company was a death. His identity was so intertwined with his title, his power, his ability to command and control, that without them, he was adrift. He would wander the halls of his cavernous penthouse, a ghost in his own life, railing against David's betrayal to an audience of one, his wife, Eleanor, who listened with the same passive silence she had always employed, though now it was tinged with a deep, weary sadness. His legacy, the Phoenix Tower, would be built, but it would be David's monument, not his. Every time he looked at the city skyline, he would be reminded of his spectacular failure, of the quiet man he had so catastrophically underestimated. Amelia was adrift in a different way. Her world, once so certain and clearly defined by wealth and status, had been revealed as a fragile illusion. The friend she had lunched with, the society figure she had sought to impress, suddenly grew distant. The story of what really happened in that boardroom spread through the city's elite circles in hushed, gleeful whispers. She was no longer the daughter of a titan. She was the foolish ex-wife of a genius, a cautionary tale. The pitying looks she had once imagined receiving were now real, and they were unbearable. She tried to contact David. She called, but he didn't answer. She sent long, rambling emails filled with apologies, explanations, and desperate pleas for a second chance. She wrote about her father's influence, her own insecurity, her blindness. It was a mix of genuine remorse and a panicked, reflexive desire to reclaim the life of prestige she had just discovered she'd thrown away. One evening, a week after the meeting, David sat in his quiet apartment reading her latest email. He felt a flicker of something, not love, not anger, but a distant clinical pity. He recognized the woman in the words, the one so terrified of not being enough that she had to tear others down to feel tall. He saw her pain, but he also recognized that the trust, the fundamental respect that forms the bedrock of a marriage, had been pulverized. It cannot be rebuilt. He agreed to meet her one last time, not in a boardroom or a fancy restaurant, but in a small, neutral cafe in a neighborhood neither of them had ever lived in. It was a place with no history, no ghosts. She arrived looking smaller, diminished. The expensive clothes seemed to hang off her, and the confident poise was gone, replaced by a nervous, fidgety energy. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice barely audible over the clink of ceramic cups. "Amelia," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Why are we here?" "I wanted to apologize," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "Properly. Face to face. What I did, what I said, it was unforgivable. I was cruel. I was blind. You were this incredible, brilliant person all along, and I threw you away because you didn't fit into my father's narrow, pathetic definition of success. I was the same person then as I am now," he said softly. "The success didn't change me. It just changed your perception of me." "I know," she choked out. "That's what's so horrible. I failed a test I didn't even know I was taking. I valued all the wrong things. And I lost the only thing that was ever truly valuable." She reached across the table, her hand hovering over his. "Is there any chance, David? Any chance at all that we could start again?" He looked at her, and for a moment, he remembered the woman he had fallen in love with, the vibrant, funny woman who existed before her father's ambition had fully consumed her. But that woman was gone, a casualty of a war of values. "No," he said, not cruelly, but with a sad finality. "I forgive you, Amelia. I have to. For my own peace of mind, I can't carry that anger. But I can't go back. The person you were married to, the one who would have weathered any storm with you, he doesn't exist anymore. You and your father, you broke him. And the man who was built in his place, he can't trust you. He will always be waiting for the next time he fails to meet some external standard of success." He stood up. "I truly hope you find happiness, Amelia. I hope you learn to build a life based on your own values, not someone else's. Find your own worth, not one that's reflected in a man or a bank account." He left a few bills on the table for the coffee and walked out, leaving her alone with her tears and the bitter taste of her choices. It was the last time they would ever speak. It was a quiet, civilized end to a story of brutal emotional violence. For David, it was the final act of closing a door, allowing him to fully face his future. For Amelia, it was the first painful step of a long journey toward figuring out who she was without the sterling name, without a powerful man by her side, and without the illusion of her own superiority. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet, relentless work. The Phoenix Tower, now renamed the Solstice Tower, rose into the sky. It was not the building Richard Sterling had envisioned, a cold, arrogant monument to wealth. It was David's vision brought to life. It was beautiful, yes, a marvel of engineering and design that seemed to catch and reflect the light in new ways with every passing hour. But it was more than that. It was a living building. The base housed a new public library and a free art gallery. The upper floors combined corporate offices with subsidized housing for artists and teachers. The roof, instead of a lavish penthouse, was a public garden, the highest green space in the city. It was a building that served the community, that gave back as much as it took from the skyline. It was the physical manifestation of David's philosophy, a testament to the idea that true legacy is not what you own, but what you contribute. The Solstice Tower was a global sensation. It won every architectural award imaginable and became a symbol of a new, more conscientious way of building. And it finally, irrevocably, pushed David into the public eye. He could no longer hide behind the pseudonym of Aurelius. The world wanted to see the man behind the masterpiece. This led to the television interview. The one Amelia was watching, wine glass in hand, in her new, much smaller apartment. She had done what David had suggested. After the divorce, she had cut ties with her family and their toxic social circle. She had gotten a job, a real job, working for a nonprofit that helped build community gardens. It was humbling, difficult work. For the first time in her life, she was judged not by her name or her connections, but by the effort she put in, by the calluses on her hands. She was slowly, painstakingly, building a new foundation for her life, one based on substance. On the screen, the interviewer was asking David about his philosophy. "You've achieved such incredible success," the interviewer said. "The wealth, the fame, the power to reshape cities. What's the secret?" David smiled, the same quiet, thoughtful smile Amelia remembered so well. "The secret," he said, "is that none of those things are the goal. They're byproducts. The goal is to build with integrity. Whether it's a skyscraper or a bookshelf, the principle is the same. You have to respect the materials, you have to understand the purpose, and you have to serve the people who will use it. True strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's quiet. It's patient. It's in the foundation, the part no one sees, but that holds everything else up." Amelia listened, and the last vestiges of her bitterness washed away, replaced by a profound, aching understanding. He hadn't become this person because of his success. He had become successful because he was, and always had been, this person. She had been given a gift, the love of a man who was all foundation, and she had thrown away because she was chasing facades. She saw him on the screen, confident, serene, a man completely at peace with himself and his place in the world. He was happy, and in a surprising, selfless moment, she found that she was happy for him. She raised her wine glass to the television, a silent, solitary toast, to the man she had lost, and to the woman she was finally, slowly becoming. A sad smile touched her lips. It was a painful lesson, learned at a catastrophic cost, but it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. That a person's true worth is never in what the world thinks of them, but in the quiet, unseen integrity of their own foundation. David chose to build a better world rather than simply destroy the one that had wronged him. He chose integrity over revenge. It's a powerful choice, but not always an easy one. What would you have done in his position? Would you have sought retribution, or would you have walked the higher path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the quiet triumph of the human spirit. We'll see you next time.